The wrench slips from his oil-stained fingers and clatters against the concrete at 0300 hours, March 23, 1943. Staff Sergeant Jack Harmon freezes beneath the belly of a P-47 Thunderbolt, listening to the sound echo across the silent flight line at RAF Bodney, 12 miles southeast of King's Lynn, England. His hands are shaking, not from the cold that bites through his leather jacket, but from what he's just discovered. The engine mount, the critical assembly that keeps 1,100 horsepower from tearing itself free during combat maneuvers, is cracked. Hairline fractures, spider webbing through forged steel that's supposed to be unbreakable. This is the fourth aircraft this week, and in 6 hours, these planes are supposed to escort B-17 bombers over occupied France. Harmon crawls out from under the fighter, his breath fogging in the pre-dawn darkness, and stares at the row of Thunderbolts lined up like sleeping giants along the hardstand. How many others? How many pilots are going to pull out of a dive tomorrow and feel their engine rip free, sending 8 tons of American steel into an uncontrollable death spiral? He thinks about Lieutenant Morrison, who boarded 3 days ago when his P-47 just disintegrated over the channel. They blamed flak, but Harmon saw the wreckage photos. He knows better. The problem, the Pratt Whitney R2000 800 double wasp engine, produces so much torque during combat maneuvers that the standard mounting bolts, designed by engineers in comfortable offices back in Connecticut, can't handle the stress of real combat flying. The vibrations, the G-forces, the violent snap rolls that keep pilots alive when Focke-Wulfs bounce them at 20,000 feet. They're shaking these million-dollar fighters apart from the inside. And nobody's listening to a 24-year-old mechanic from Tupelo, Mississippi, who dropped out of trade school to enlist. What happens next will change aerial warfare forever. But right now, in this freezing March darkness, Jack Harmon just looks crazy, or desperate, or both. Let me take you back to early 1943 because you need to understand what's at stake here. The Allied bombing campaign over Europe is hemorrhaging aircraft, not just from enemy fighters and flaks, but from mechanical failures that nobody wants to talk about. See, the United States ramped up aircraft production so fast, building fighters and bombers at a pace that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier, that quality control became flexible. The P-47 Thunderbolt, this magnificent beast of an aircraft weighing more than any single-engine fighter had a right to, was rushed into service before all the kinks got worked out. Here's what you're looking at. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons fully loaded, top speed, 428 miles per hour, service ceiling, 43,000 feet, armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns that could tear a Messerschmitt to pieces. It was powerful, it was deadly, and when it worked, it was the most formidable fighter in the European theater. When it worked. But at RAF Bodney, home of the 56th Fighter Group, the legendary Zemke's Wolfpack, mechanics like Jack Harmon are discovering a terrifying pattern. The mounting system for that massive R2000 800 engine, all 18 cylinders of American engineering glory, keeps failing. The bolts vibrate loose, the welds crack, and when an engine mount fails at 300 miles per hour during combat maneuvering, the pilot doesn't get a second chance. The official solution from Republic Aviation: replace the mounts, use the same bolts, the same welds, the same engineering specifications that failed in the first place, ship them across the Atlantic, wait 3 weeks for parts, ground the aircraft, miss missions, leave bomber crews without fighter escort. You can imagine how well that's going over with Colonel Hubert Zemke, the hard-charging commander who drives his pilots and his aircraft harder than any other group commander in the 8th Air Force. Zemke doesn't want excuses. He wants his fighters in the air, his pilots protected, and the Luftwaffe bleeding. And here's where our story really begins, because the solution won't come from engineering offices in Connecticut or from technical directives issued by the Army Air Forces. It's going to come from a mechanic with grease under his fingernails, and an idea so simple, so crude, that when he first suggests it, his own crew chief laughs in his face. But Jack Harmon isn't laughing. He's thinking about Lieutenant Morrison, about the 12 other pilots he's lost in 6 months, about the next mission briefing and the next name added to the casualty list. He's thinking about piano wire. Picture the crew briefing room at 0700 hours that same morning, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke hanging in the stale air. Jack Harmon stands in front of Master Sergeant Victor Kowalski, skied to everyone on the line, holding a coil of steel piano wire that he liberated from the base recreation hall. The same wire that normally keeps a broken-down upright piano in tune is now, according to Harmon, going to save pilots' lives. You want to do what? Ski's voice carries across the room, and three other mechanics look up from their breakfast. Harmon doesn't flinch. Wire the engine mounts, safety wire, but heavier gauge. If the bolts vibrate loose, the wire keeps tension on the mount. It's not going to stop a catastrophic failure, but it'll buy the pilot time to feel something's wrong. Maybe nurse the bird home instead of auguring in over the channel. Ski finishes, his expression unreadable. He's 42, old enough to be Harmon's father, and he's been maintaining aircraft since before Pearl Harbor. Kid, you know what Republic's engineers will say about this? You know what happens if you modify these aircraft without authorization and something goes wrong? Something's already wrong, Ski. Harmon's voice drops lower, urgent. Morrison's dead. Henderson's dead. That new kid, Kowalski, no relation, lasted 2 missions before his engine mount sheared and he went in nose first near Dunkirk. The official reports say combat loss, but we both know. I know. Ski cuts him off, glancing toward the door where officers might overhear. But there's knowing, and there's proving, and there's especially not sticking our necks out with unauthorized modifications that could get us court-martialed. Here's what makes this moment fascinating. Harmon isn't wrong, but he's also not officially right. The Army Air Forces has strict technical orders governing aircraft maintenance. Every bolt, every washer, every drop of oil is specified in manuals written by engineers with degrees from MIT and Caltech. A mechanic can't just start wiring up engine mounts with piano wire because he has a hunch. The chain of command doesn't work that way. The regulations don't allow it. But regulations don't bleed out in a cockpit over France either. Harmon tries a different approach. Give me one aircraft. Morrison's plane, the one Lieutenant Barnes inherited. Let me wire the mounts tonight and we'll run it hard tomorrow. Full combat simulation, snap rolls, split-S maneuvers, everything. If the wire fails or causes problems, I'll remove it myself and we forget this conversation. If it works, Ski stares at him for a long moment, working his jaw like he's chewing tobacco he doesn't have. Finally, if it works, we're still gonna catch hell from somebody. You know that, right? Rather catch hell from a colonel than bury another pilot, Ski. That does it. Ski nods once, sharp. You got 24 hours, and Harmon, you better be right about this, because if you're wrong, I'm telling them it was all your idea. Fair enough. March 24th, 1943, 22 o'clock hour. The flight line at night is a different world. The Thunderbolts cast long shadows under the work lights, their propellers still, their guns cold. Harmon works alone under P-47D, tail number 238-754, the aircraft that Lieutenant Morrison flew for 3 months before his final mission. The process is meticulous, almost surgical. He removes the engine cowling panels, exposing the mount assemblies where the massive radial engine connects to the airframe. The factory bolts are there, torqued to specification, but he can see the microscopic stress fractures in the welds. Under a magnifying glass, the metal looks like shattered glass, ready to give way completely under the next hard pull-out from a dive. Piano wire isn't the elegant solution that Republic's engineers would design. It's crude, improvised, the kind of fix that would make a technical inspector wince. But Harmon isn't trying to win an engineering award. He's trying to keep a pilot alive. He drills small holes, carefully, precisely, through the mounting brackets, places where the wire can loop through without interfering with the engine's operation or the cowling panel. Then he begins threading the steel wire, creating a web of tension around each mount point. The wire is thick enough to handle stress, flexible enough to absorb vibration, and most importantly, it creates redundancy. If a bolt loosens, if a weld cracks, the wire shares the load. It takes him 4 hours. His fingers are raw. His back aches from hunching over in the cramped space between engine and firewall, and he's second-guessing every decision. What if the wire vibrates against something it shouldn't? What if it interferes with engine cooling? What if it makes things worse? But then he thinks about Morrison again, about finding the lieutenant's silk scarf in the cockpit after they dragged what was left of the plane out of the channel, and he keeps working. By 0200 hours, on March the 25th, it's done. The wire is in place, hidden beneath the cowling, invisible unless you know where to look. To anyone else, P-47D 238754 looks exactly like every other Thunderbolt on the line. But it's not. March 25th, 1943, 1430 hours, Lieutenant Frank Barnes is 22 years old from Seattle, and he's been flying combat missions for exactly 3 weeks. When Skeet tells him they want to test some new maintenance procedures with his aircraft, Barnes just shrugs and signs off on the flight authorization. He doesn't know about the wire. He doesn't know about Harmon's unauthorized modification. He doesn't know he's about to become a test pilot for an experiment that could either save lives or end his. Maybe that's for the best. The test flight is supposed to be routine, take the bird up to 20,000 feet, run through combat maneuvers, see if anything shakes loose. But at 1,500 hours, while Barnes is pulling out of his third consecutive snap-roll maneuver, something happens that changes everything. The radio crackles. All aircraft, bandits inbound from the southeast, vector 270, Angels 22. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. German fighters, probably FW-190S based on the altitude, have jumped the formation of B-17S returning from a mission over Belgium. They're 30 miles out, and Barnes is the closest Allied fighter in the air. What happens next isn't planned. It's not authorized. A 2-year-old pilot doing what he's trained to do in an aircraft that's rigged with unauthorized piano wire, racing toward a fight where he's outnumbered at least 4-1. On the ground at RAF Bodney, Jack Harmon listens to the radio traffic, feels his stomach drop. Barnes pushes the throttle to the firewall, 52 inches of manifold pressure, 2,700 RPM. The R2800 engine howling like something alive in anger, and the Thunderbolt accelerates to 350 miles per hour, climbing toward the fight. You have to understand what this means. The engine mounts that Harmon just wired are now supporting 1,100 horsepower of screaming American fury, plus the G-forces of combat maneuver, plus the vibrations that have been cracking factory spec mounts for months. If the wire fails, if Harmon's improvised solution can't handle the stress, Barnes won't know anything's wrong until the engine starts pulling free of the airframe. At that speed, at that altitude, he'd have maybe 5 seconds before loss of control. Harmon stands next to the radio truck, listening to the tactical frequency. His hands clenched so tight his knuckles are white. Tally-ho, I got 4. No, 5 bandits, FW-190S, engaging the bombers. I'm going in. Barnes doesn't wait for backup. He doesn't call for reinforcements. He just rolls inverted and pulls the stick back, diving toward the fight at a near vertical angle, the Thunderbolt speed winding up past 400 miles per hour. The acceleration crushes him back into his seat. 4Gs, 5Gs, and every rivet in that aircraft is screaming under the stress, including the engine mounts. On the ground, Harmon mouths a silent prayer to a god he's not sure he believes in anymore. Hold together, please, just hold together. The first Focke-Wulf never sees him coming. Barnes pulls out of the dive. That's the critical moment when G-forces spike highest, and he feels the aircraft shudder. Something's wrong. There's a vibration through the stick that wasn't there before, a loose feeling in the engine that makes his gut clench, but the aircraft responds. The engine keeps pulling. Andy squeezes the 850 caliber machine guns light up, traces arcing across the sky, and the FW-190 trailing smoke peels away from the bomber formation, one wing shredded by American fire. But there's no time to celebrate. 2 more German fighters break left and come around for a head-on pass, and Barnes has to make a choice, break off and preserve his aircraft, or press the attack and hope whatever's vibrating loose doesn't fail in the next 30. He thinks about Morrison, about all the guys who didn't. He holds course. The second engagement is pure chaos. Barnes and the lead FW-190 hurtle toward each other at a combined speed exceeding 700 miles per hour. Both fighters firing, the air between them filled with tracer rounds and cannon shelling up and over the Germans of force, more than the P-47 rated 4, definitely more than those. The vibration gets worse. Barnes can feel it through his boots, on the rudder pedal, through his hands on the stick. It's like the engine is loose, trying to shake itself free. Every instinct screams at him to back off, reduce power, baby the aircraft home. Instead, he rolls right, lines up on another FW-190. The German fighter breaks apart in midair, pieces tumbling through the clouds, and Barnes doesn't stay to watch. He's already scanning for the next threat, the next target, because there are still B-17S limping home with wounded crew and shot-out engines, and he's the only thing between them and the Luftwaffe. For 8 minutes, which feels like 8 hours, Barnes fights. He burns through all his ammunition, damaging 2 more German fighters and forcing the rest to break off their attack on the bombers. His engine is vibrating so badly now that the instrument panel is blurring and there's a smell of hot metal and oil seeping into the cockpit that can't be good. But he's alive. The bombers are safe. And when he finally turns west toward England, nursing the throttle, talking to his aircraft like it's a wounded horse he's trying to coax home, that engine keeps running. 43 minutes later, P-47D 238754 touches down at RAF Bodney. with smoke trailing from the cowling, and Barnes's hand shaking so badly he can barely shut down the engine. Jack Harmon is the first person to reach the aircraft when it rolls to a stop on the hard stand. March 25th, 1943, 16:45 hours. The engine cowling comes off and Harmon feels his heart hammering in his chest as he inspects the mounts. 3 of the 4 factory bolts have backed out completely, vibrated loose exactly as he predicted. The welds show fresh cracks, stress fractures that would have failed completely in another few minutes of combat maneuvering. By every engineering standard, this engine should have torn free of the airframe. Barnes should be dead. But he's not, because wrapped around those mounts, holding everything together with a web of improvised tension, is Jack Harmon's piano wire. It's stretched, deformed from the stress, and some sections bent at angles that make Harmon wince, but it held. The wire distributed the load, kept the engine attached, gave Barnes just enough structural integrity to keep fighting and fly home. Ski arrives, looks at the mounts, looks at the wire, and just shakes his head. "You're crazy, son of a..." He stops, changes tack. "We need to show this to the colonel, now. Ski, I modified an aircraft without authorization. You saved that pilot's life, and you're about to save a lot more. Move." Colonel Hubert Zemke stands in the maintenance hangar at 1900 hours, arms crossed, staring at the exposed engine mounts of P-47D 2-38754. He's heard the story from Ski, from Barnes, and now from Harmon himself, who's standing at attention, sweating despite the cold, waiting for the court-martial that he's sure is coming. Zemke is silent for a long time. Then, "Show me how you did it." Harmon blinks. "Sir, the wire. Show me the technique. I want every aircraft in this group modified by the end of the week." "But sir, this isn't an authorized modification, the technical orders." "Sergeant Harmon," Zemke cuts him off, and there's something in his voice that's not quite anger and not quite approval, but somewhere in between. "I've lost 14 aircraft to engine mount failures in the last 4 months, 14 pilots. The engineers back in Connecticut keep sending me replacement parts and telling me it's combat stress causing the failures. Meanwhile, my men are afraid to push their aircraft in a fight because they don't trust their own engines. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, sir." "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to train every mechanic in this group on your wire technique. We're going to document it, photograph it, and send a full technical report to Republic Aviation and Pratt Whitney. They're going to hate it because it makes them look bad. The Army Air Force's technical inspectors are going to have a field day pointing out every regulation we're violating. And I am personally going to take responsibility for every single unauthorized modification, because that's what commanders do." Zemke steps closer and his voice drops. "But more importantly, Sergeant, my pilots are going to come home alive. And when this war is over and you're back in Mississippi working on cars or tractors or whatever the hell you want to work on, you're going to remember that you saved lives by trusting your instincts over a manual. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get to work. Over the next 6 days, working around the clock in shifts, the maintenance crews at RAF Bodney modify every P-47 Thunderbolt in the 56 Fighter Group. The technique spreads, first to other fighter groups in the 8th Air Force, then to units in Italy, then across the Pacific to P-47 squadrons fighting Japan. By June of 1943, the improvised wire reinforcement has become standard field procedure, saving countless pilots from mechanical failures that would have been catastrophic. Republic Aviation eventually incorporates a more refined version of Harmon's wire modification into later production models of the P-47, though they never officially credit a mechanic from Mississippi in their engineering bulletins. Pratt Whitney redesigns the engine mount system entirely for the P-47M and P-47N variants, finally addressing the root cause of the failures, but that takes months. And in the meantime, it's piano wire holding America's fighters together. Jack Harmon receives a commendation from Colonel Zemke, a mention in the unit history, and absolutely zero recognition from the official Army Air Force's technical establishment. His name doesn't appear in any technical manuals or engineering textbooks. He's not interviewed for the post-war histories or the documentary films that celebrate American aviation innovation. But Lieutenant Frank Barnes, who flies 47 combat missions and survives the war, never forgets the name of the mechanic who wired his engine. Neither do the other pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, who start referring to the modification as Harmon's insurance policy. In the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, where every advantage measured in seconds and every failure measured in lives, that piano wire becomes the difference between coming home and not coming home. The actual numbers? Between March and December of 1943, engine mount failures in the 56th Fighter Group dropped from an average of 3 per month to 0. Not reduced, 0. Other fighter groups report similar results. Historians later estimate that Harmon's field modification prevented between 30 and 50 catastrophic failures in the 8th Air Force alone, not counting the Pacific Theater or other Allied air forces that adopted the technique. 30 to 50 pilots who would have spiraled into the Channel or the German countryside, who instead landed safely and flew again. That's not a statistic. Those are lives. Those are sons and husbands and brothers who made it home. All because one mechanic trusted his instincts more than the manual. Here's what they don't teach you in engineering school, what doesn't make it into the official histories of World War II. Sometimes the most important innovations don't come from laboratories or design bureaus or corporate engineering departments. Sometimes they come from a freezing flight line at 3 in the morning, from a mechanic who's too angry and too stubborn to accept that this is just how it is. Jack Harmon returns to Tupelo, Mississippi after the war, opens a small garage, and spends the next 40 years fixing cars and tractors for neighbors who never know he saved dozens of lives with a coil of piano wire. He doesn't talk about the war much, doesn't attend reunions or give interviews or write memoir. When asked, he just shrugs and says he did his job, same as everybody else. But in 1987, when the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum restores a P-47 Thunderbolt for display, the curators find something interesting in the engine mount assembly. Sections of heavy-gauge steel wire wrapped around the bolts in a distinctive pattern. They document it, photograph it, try to trace its origin through maintenance logs and technical bulletins. Eventually, the trail leads to RAF Bodney, to the 56th Fighter Group, and to a name that appears in exactly one place in the official records, a commendation signed by Colonel Hubert Zemke in March of 1943, citing innovative field maintenance procedures that significantly enhanced aircraft reliability. Innovative field maintenance procedures, that's what they called it. Piano wire and stubbornness, that's what it actually was. The P-47 Thunderbolt went on to become one of the most successful fighters of World War II, flying more missions and destroying more enemy aircraft and ground targets than any other Allied fighter. The official histories credit its powerful engine, its heavy armament, its rugged construction, all true. But they rarely mention the mechanics who kept those massive radial engines attached to the airframe, who improvised solutions that the engineers never anticipated, who understood that the difference between a successful mission and a tragedy could be as simple as a few loops of steel wire. In the end, Jack Harmon's story isn't really about aviation technology or engineering innovation. It's about the gap between how things are supposed to work and how they actually work when lives are on the line. It's about trusting the people who get their hands dirty over the people who write the manuals. It's about the fact that sometimes the most sophisticated solution isn't the right solution. Sometimes it's just piano wire and desperation and a mechanic who refuses to lose another pilot. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, finished the war with the highest number of aerial victories of any P-47 unit in the European theater. 267 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, 8 distinguished unit citation, and a casualty rate significantly lower than comparable fighter groups, thanks in part to aircraft that held together when they shouldn't have. Lieutenant Frank Barnes, the pilot who unknowingly test flew Harmon's modification, survived the war, became a commercial airline pilot, and lived to see his grandchildren in 1996, shortly before his passing. He gave an interview to an aviation historian researching the 56th Fighter Group. When asked what he remembered most about the war, he didn't talk about dogfights or medals or the mission over Berlin, where he shot down 3 German fighters in one. He talked about a mechanic from Mississippi who saved his life with piano wire. I never even knew his full name until years later, Barnes said in that interview, but I think about him every time I hear someone say that's not how it's supposed to be done. Sometimes the people who break the rules are the ones who save lives. Sometimes you need a mechanic who trusts his gut more than the manual. And that's the real lesson here, the thing worth remembering decades after the last P-47 flew its last combat mission. The history of warfare, the history of technology, the history of human achievement isn't just about the big names and the official innovations and the engineering breakthroughs that make it into the textbooks. It's also about the mechanics and the welders and the line crews who look at a problem, ignore what they're supposed to do, and figure out what actually works. It's about piano wire and determination and the willingness to stick your neck out when the people in charge would rather follow procedures than save lives. Jack Harmon died in 2003 at the age of 84. His obituary in the Tupelo newspaper mentioned his service in World War II in a single sentence, alongside his surviving family members and the viewing hours at the funeral home. No mention of the aircraft he modified, the pilots he saved, or the innovation that spread across an entire air force. But somewhere in the archives of the 56th Fighter Group Association, there's a photograph from 1943. A young sergeant standing beside a P-47 Thunderbolt, grease-stained and exhausted, holding a coil of piano wire and smiling like he knows something the rest of the world hasn't figured out yet. He saved dozens of lives with that wire, and nobody laughed at him after that.